Good morning and welcome to the daily cyber briefing for Thursday, the 27th of February. I'm Stephen Ridgway. There's a vulnerability in Libra Office that allows attackers to run malicious code on Windows machines. It is a vulnerability in the way in which LibreOffice determines whether a hyperlink is pointing to an executable or not. So within the LibreOffice environment, if you control click something, one of the things you can do is point to particular files. Well, there's it passes that to the Windows Shell Execute API. And it is then, it's designed to stop executable files from being run through LibreOffice. Unfortunately, because of the way that the URLs are checked, it is possible to craft URLs that bypass those controls. That stuff happens. Just be aware of it. So if you are concerned that your instances of LibreOffice being one of the more commonly used alternatives to like the Microsoft Office suite out there. Pretty cool. I used to use OpenOffice, which is, I think, the predecessor to, or I don't know, they're all come from the same root. They've evolved from various Office suites, but LibreOffice is pretty cool. The LibreOffice maintainers have released a patched version, which is 24.8.5. Released it on the 25th, so a couple of days ago. Has enhanced validation checks that block non-file URL interpretations as local file paths. So basically, directly addresses the issue. So if you are using LibreOffice, check to make sure that you have updated it. If you're using it across your environment, make sure that your software deployment, patching and maintenance stuff has picked up on the fact that there's a new version of LibreOffice out there. You are aiming to be on 24.8.5 or above. All right, so in other matters, you will be aware that we've spoken a lot about sort of good design, good architecture being a very solid way to make attackers' lives more difficult. So a good deal of defense is down to good architecture. There's an article in GB Hackers that talks about threat actors using, they call them ephemeral ports, but they're not really. They're high ports. I mean, they may be ephemeral or they may not be ephemeral, but they are high ports. For those that don't get the difference, ephemeral ports are things that come and go. Something that's ephemeral is here today and gone tomorrow, mayflies, that kind of thing. High ports are simply ports above, what used to be relatively low number, 1024 or something, but is now, I think, less well defined in common usage. I've got to admit, I'm a little bit surprised about this article. This is something that has been going on for at least the 25, 30 odd years I've been in cyber and tech and so on and so forth. Of course, you use high ports for things that you want to. So the key thing to this is, no shit, Sherlock. Malware tends to use unusual ports. The other side of that one is, by the way, if you move common services onto unusual ports, a lot of automated script kiddie type malware can't find the ports to compromise because they're just not looking. So The fact that in this particular example they're talking about covert communications on port 60102 is just neither here nor there. It's just the way it is. What we should be thinking about is controlling both ingress and egress traffic. Now, in the good old days where a network had a boundary and it was a firewall, almost nobody actually controlled anything that went out from that. You were in that top 10% of secure organisations if anybody had actually thought to stop connections that were going outbound. Goodness me. If it's coming from the inside, it's bound to be okay, isn't it? Yeah, right. These days, okay, one could argue it's more complicated, except it isn't really. If you've got a cloud-based environment, you can still control what traffic egress is from your cloud environments. If you're concerned about endpoints, which is, I think, a very good concern to have, apply some corporate managed, centrally managed endpoint protection that again blocks outbound connections to ports that are not required for business purposes. Yeah, all right, you might have a minor grumble from a small percentage of people in an organisation when something that they probably shouldn't have been doing in the first place suddenly stops working. Tempted to say, grow up and deal with it. So, I'm surprised that we need to have articles talking about control, the shock that malware runs on unusual ports. And that's why if you're using things, if you're using port scanners, Nmap or whatever, to look for interesting or vulnerable stuff in your own, hopefully, or with permission elsewhere, devices, just doing a standard scan on known ports will give you a very vanilla view of what's going on, and may well almost definitely will miss anything that's actually genuinely interesting, unless the machine's riddled with malware, of course, but in case who only knows. But yeah, so the recommendations in the article that we'll link to the briefing talk about restricting network traffic. Yes, that is, I think, the most important thing. Monitoring for anomalous connections, again, yes, using IDS solutions, host and network IDS would be good. And of course, obviously, tracking file downloads and what happens to them. So it comes down to what we've talked about an enormous amount over the last 5 years, 6 years of out there, TSC talking to the world. In order to understand what's going on, you need to know what's happening on your endpoints. You need to know what's traversing your networks. And if you're using the internet as your network, you need to know what your devices are talking across the internet about and what the internet is talking to your devices about. And then you also need to have relevant security logs from things like SaaS services or application servers, whatever it may be. Given those three domains of information, the intersection between those is good security visibility. And this falls into that. Know what's going on in your network and control it. Okay, on other matters, if you ever wondered how much a ransomware, or basically how much a cyber attack actually costs, it is difficult to get decent figures from these, but Southern Water in the UK has actually admitted that last year's cyber attack, so about a year ago, they were hit by a cyber attack. Well, it's come out in their annual financial statements. It cost them about £4.5 million to deal with that attack. Now, to put that in context, okay, that's broadly the same as the amount of money they spend on pollution management. So one could argue that avoiding those costs, and apparently those costs don't include hit to reputation, legal fees, all sorts of other things. Um, I think there's a reasonable argument to say that had Southern Water spent anything up to 4.5 million on securing themselves, they wouldn't have been hit by this particular piece of ransomware. So think about that when you're deciding on how much is it worth spending on the cybersecurity in your own organisations. And I think, for those of us that actually have our water supplied by Southern Water, it is fair to say they are not doing a good job in areas like pollution control anyway, and the money would have been far better spent on the things it should have been spent on. So yeah, but that's kind of like what the costs of this stuff would be. It makes for interesting reading if you are concerned about the economic or financial impact of what actually happens to companies like major companies that have been hit. It is expensive. And then finally from me today, there is an interesting article in the Register that talks about a vulnerability in the Great Firewall of China. It has now been patched, which is why people are talking about it. However, for quite a while, there was a vulnerability in the DNS system that the GFW uses, which was leaking small chunks of memory back out. So, and that has been used to understand to a large, to improve our understanding of how the Chinese government's firewall actually works. Now, to put it in context, one of the most effective ways that the firewall functions, if you are trying to browse out from inside China, your DNS requests are intercepted by components of the Great Firewall. If the great and the good of the Chinese government think you're trying to go to somewhere that you shouldn't, they effectively black hole the DNS query. Very simple, very effective. Now, why am I telling us this? Well, partly because it is interesting to see how nation states implement mass control over parts of the internet. The internet being designed to get around these sorts of things just by its nature. It's a pretty resilient solution. So how has it been possible for the Chinese government to control what people can get to? Well, this is one easy way that they do it. Also, it is something that is useful in your own environments if you are thinking about ways in which you can, as I was saying, ways in which you can control what malware, for example, is doing. Well, controlling DNS is a really good way of dealing with that. It kind of leads on to the fact that, well, of all of the things that one should be monitoring, DNS is something that really should be being ingested into your SIEM or your security visibility tooling. What queries are being made? Because not only can you control the connections, as we were saying, to unusual high network ports, you can actually stop the compromised end device from even being able to attempt the connections. Because, well, let me look at it this way. If the IP address is first, let's say command and control, if the IP addresses are hard-coded into a piece of malware, it is reasonably simple to black hole those IP addresses. It needs a little bit of cooperation amongst major telcos. but a simple routing update can just kill connections to a specific IP address, which I know does get done. Okay, occasionally they pull their fingers out and do this sort of stuff. If, however, malware is connecting to a name, the name can be made to resolve to multiple IP addresses. That is much harder to black hole at a network level, because obviously the threat actors can spin up new instances under the same name but with different IP addresses very easily, and because of DNS will point you to the currently active C2 server, it is much harder. You end up chasing your own tail, trying to block things at an IP level. However, you can black hole the DNS name. So, thinking about how DNS works, this is what triggered, this article triggered this thought. We haven't spoken about this for a while on this briefing, but having logs of DNS is, I would say, a minimum piece of basic cyber hygiene. Doing stuff with that, as in looking for unusual resolutions, it is the next step up. You can get a bit more sophisticated with this. You can actually automate things like if the DNS request is for a name which has only recently been created and matches certain criteria, as in it's not it's some long random string of numbers, that sort of thing, then that's highly suspicious. So not only log it, that probably deserves an alert into your SIEM, and your SOC team ought to be doing some triage on it, that sort of stuff. So have a little think about that. Anyway, that's all from me for this Thursday. Hope you have a good day, and I will speak to you all again tomorrow morning.